Come along with us on a wholehearted journey through the complexities of being human and mental health at this point in history. In Bridging Generations, Exploring Mental Health Together, join my favorite daughter, Karen Baker, a graduate counseling student, and me, Wayne Baker, a licensed professional counselor for close to 20 years. We delve deep into the world of relationships and mental well-being. We're both therapists, yoga teachers, a little ADD, and lifelong learners. Together, we hope to create a safe, secure, and encouraging environment in which we can learn, reflect, engage, and possibly find a community where we feel less alone. Additionally, we encourage one another to explore what it means to live in connection with ourselves and each other. So let's begin with a big, slow exhale and continue this journey with deep listening, radical curiosity, and profound compassion. So welcome back, everybody. We are glad you are with us today. It's good to be here with you, Karen.
Good to be here with you, Dad.
So today, I think we're going to continue our conversation about trauma, because it's such a big topic in our field right now. There's lots of different point of views and lots of perspectives, lots of research, and still in some things, people don't agree and people might use different terms, and by no means do we think we are experts. I think I said in another training I was doing that I never want to be called an expert, because I'm a lifelong learner and I am constantly learning things. So that's where you said it earlier, is that we want to invite people to be part of the conversation.
Yes.
Right?
Yes. Because it's bridging generations. I mean, it's this whole idea is to have conversations around these topics, especially topics that can be divisive or like things that we are still learning about. I mean, I have been really lucky enough really early in my career to have some really outstanding trainings in like EMDR and ETT, internal family systems, like a lot of really amazing trainings, information led by people that know a lot about trauma. So I've learned a lot, but like you said too, like I'm still learning. I'm literally, because I'm still in grad school, at least for the next 5 weeks. Woohoo. So yeah, woohoo. The other part of like why we wanted to talk about this today is to create, at least for me, it was to create more context around some of the terminology that's thrown around a lot that isn't necessarily used wrong, because words can be interpreted in any kind of way. But, and I'm certainly not going to tell somebody that they're using something wrong or whatever, but to create more context and provide more information around certain things. Specifically, the thing that really instigated this was a conversation we had in lecture a couple weeks ago, is that trauma is not what happened to you. It's the result of what happened to you. And there's a quote that I will probably say 6 other times during this podcast. It's from Gabor Maté's In the Realm of Hungry Ghosts, which is a really amazing book on addiction and trauma. And it says, trauma is what happened inside of you as a result of what happens to you. And that's really where
Good.
Yeah, brilliant. You the main man, Gabor. And so that's really kind of where I think this conversation for us starts.
And the number one thing that I have seen and read, it's that people can go through horrific things, but there's this sense of being alone. When you talk about what happened inside of you, at least that's one of the components, maybe the biggest one, is, was I alone? Physically, emotionally, relationally, was there a sense of aloneness when I went through the thing that I went through? If you're there with somebody or receive support almost immediately, very, very quickly afterwards, it's less likely to develop into PTSD or something even worse, because of the lack of aloneness. If you had support, if there was somebody there with you going through it, or supported you.
Yeah, I think of, as you're saying this, The Tribe on Homecoming and Belonging by Sebastian Junger. Another really terrific book that's about a 3.5 hour listen if you have Audible or something, but he discusses that same concept, that Native American First Nation cultures like had these amazing rituals around community when people would come back, when warriors would come back. Before they reintegrated back into society, it was collectively the whole tribe came together to grieve around loss of life, of other people, of community, of the land, around the land. I mean, it was the togetherness around all of that. And the other thing too, and then like to go back around the being alone, and I mean, you've kind of said this, it's or you were perceived to be alone, whether it was being shamed by a basketball coach or an English teacher. Not my English teachers, they were great. Shout out to Miss Herring and Miss Heckle. Y'all are the best. But the perception of being alone. The other quote that I have written down that kind of touches into a lot of these different things is from Bruce Perry's What Happened to You. Is there are 3 E's of trauma: event, experience, and effects. What was the event? What was the experience? Did you feel alone? Were you alone? And then now what's the result? What is the effect? How is it showing up?
Yeah, what's the meaning that you're making?
Yeah.
Of the event and the story you're telling yourself.
As we continue into this conversation too, we're going to be discussing some heavy topics. And at any point, you need to pause and walk away from listening to this, do so. And at the end of this episode, or at the same time this episode is published, there will also be a guided meditation to ground yourself if you have some type of visceral response as we talk about some of these topics. Now, we're not going to go into graphic details on anything, but we're going to discuss some of the high levels around some different types of trauma, which might bring up some stuff for people as the audience, our peoples, are listening to this, which is totally understandable. And obviously, there's some really heavy conversations, some really big conversations around a lot of what we're talking about. And something we've discussed in preparing for this is like, we could spend 1 season alone talking about trauma because there's so much information. Right. And a lot of it can be really, really helpful. And so it's also deciphering what do we want to include, but I digress. So that's really invitation and giving yourself permission to, you need to walk away from this series that we do at any point in time, do so, that's okay. And then come back whenever you're ready. Or something doesn't feel right, feel into your feet, take a deep breath. It'll all be okay. And there's going to be a guided meditation at the same time as this to listen to ground and feel more centered before you go off on the rest of your day. So,
nice.
Yeah.
So, do you want to talk about what happens at a neurological level?
I would love to.
Nice.
So this is one of the things that I have found most helpful in my own journey of healing, processing some of my own trauma, and that I find what is incredibly helpful with my clients, because this is all an evolutionary response to make sure that you keep surviving. There is nothing wrong with your brain. It's the adaptive response to make sure that you could keep going and outrun the lion or dinosaur or saber-toothed tiger, or whatever.
I don't
And
think we were here when there were dinosaurs.
yeah, probably not. Yeah, you're right.
But I get what you mean.
Yeah, you know, you're picking up what I put down. Saber-tooth tiger, maybe. But oh my gosh, never mind. I was about to have such an ADD moment. But when I went to the Houston Natural Science Museum, they had the giant sloths.
Oh, I was just going to talk about the giant sloths.
Those things are terrifying looking, like not the cute little like three-toed sloths that like move like an inch a day. Like this thing is scary.
Well, I was listening to NPR yesterday, and because of all the rain that the West Coast has had, and mudslides and erosion, I can't remember who did the interview, but they were this kindergarten class in Santa Cruz, California, was out playing in the mud, basically. And these little boys, maybe there were little girls there too, I don't know, but they interviewed one or two little boys. They were building a dam in this little creek, and one guy saw this thing sticking out of the dirt, and it was a bone. And so they went over and they got it. And then somehow, I don't remember all the details, but the Santa Cruz Natural History Museum got a hold of it, and it's on display now. And these little boys got credit for finding these new little scientists that are 7 years old. And one little kid says, well, we were just hunting for quadads. It was so cute. But this bone was from a giant sloth, which they were fierce and probably weighed 2,000 pounds, So, yeah, so they were scary.
Yes, I'm 6'1" and that thing like towered over me. That is the cutest thing ever. And for somebody who played archaeologists with her friends in kindergarten, I'm so jealous. Okay.
It's not a bone.
Yeah. Oh my
A
God.
giant sloth bone.
That would be so cool. Okay.
Central Texas.
Yeah. Okay, so neurobiological level, what happens with trauma? Back to
Yes.
why they're here.
Why our brain works the way it works.
Yeah, why our brain
to keep us alive, and where's our next meal, and what keeps us from getting eaten from the days of the giant sloth.
Yes,
and the saber-tooth tiger.
Yes, exactly.
Okay.
And I am by no means a brain scientist. I have done a lot of research. A lot of what I'm about to talk about comes from.
But the good news is you have a brain.
I do have a brain.
A really good one.
Yeah, there are a lot of grooves in the brain. Real smart brain. Yes, and so a lot of this information comes from Bessel van der Kolk's Body Keeps the Score. It comes from Gabor Maté's In the Realm of Hungry Ghosts. We'll have a whole list of other references and things that we mentioned in the show notes. I'm going to talk about the limbic system, which is one of the oldest parts of our brains. Specifically, there are 3 parts of the limbic system. There are more, but the parts that I'm going to talk about are the amygdala, the hippocampus, and the hypothalamus. The amygdala is known as the smoke detector, which is constantly taking information via the hypothalamus, and it's assessing whether or not our environment is safe. If there is a giant sloth around.
That should be our mascot. I want the giant sloth to be our mascot.
Sloth. I would be okay with that. Maybe a sloth that's dressed as Carl Jung or Freud or something. I'll pay somebody to make a t-shirt or a sticker that's a series of, the dogs playing poker, but it's the giant sloths sitting around the table.
Doing therapy.
Yes. So while the amygdala is really great at categorizing information, trauma, distress, stress does increase the probability of a misinterpretation of a threat. So as the amygdala is taking in information, it sends signals to the hypothalamus and the hippocampus and is constantly assessing for emotional significance, safety, all those things. So example, you hear the sound of a car backfiring, or you hear the grumble of a giant sloth. And it sends a signal to the hypothalamus, which tells the sympathetic nervous system, fight, flight, freeze, to release hormones to protect you from a threat or a perceived threat, like sending cortisol, adrenaline, preparing you to fight or flight, freeze, like your heart starts pumping faster, you start taking more air into your air and oxygen into your lungs, like you're getting ready to take off or hit the deck. And then a second signal gets to the hippocampus for a more accurate interpretation of the grumble of a sloth or the sound of a car backfiring. And you realize like, oh, like this is just a car, I'm okay. Or no, this is a saber-toothed tiger sloth horror, I need to run away. And so then another signal is sent to the hypothalamus, which tells the parasympathetic nervous system, which oversees rest and digest, to turn on, settle your heart rate, and go back to homeostasis. However, in moments of enduring stress, of chronic trauma, I mean, I kind of go back and forth on however you want to describe it, stress, trauma, distress, whatever. Where there's so much cortisol, adrenaline, all of these hormones that are flooding the entire limbic system. It becomes so flooded that signals are unable to reach the hippocampus. And so these signals aren't filed away properly, leaving somebody in a state of distress. And so essentially this situation, this memory becomes misfiled, and the brain thinks that the distressing or traumatic incident is still going on. And Gabor Maté, in his book, Realm of Hungry Ghosts, says that neural pathways in the limbic system, amygdala, hippocampus, are stored as traumatic memories. And those memories become trapped, essentially causing someone to live in a state of fight, flight, or freeze. And there's a ton of research around like what constant cortisol, what constant stress hormones do to the limbic system and your prefrontal cortex, and that it can shrink parts of your brain. And those are what can be one of the results of trauma, ongoing trauma. How'd I do?
Really good.
Thank you.
Yeah. So the question then is, how do we move this event, this memory, from the limbic system,
Yeah.
primarily from the hippocampus, right, to where it's the memory of an event is stored, or it hasn't been integrated or stored yet,
Right.
to a different part of the brain where it becomes stored memory.
Yeah.
We remember it. It has, oh yeah, I remember. It's a reminder, and that's all it is.
Yeah, and I
The other thing, sorry, go ahead.
No, you go.
Well, this is, you're talking about it, just remember how I'm thinking about how complex the brain is, and that it changes throughout our life based on various life experiences.
Yeah, I'm thinking of, I mean, it's like that question, like how do we take something that has not been filed away, that's frozen in time, that's trauma, is it's experiencing being frozen in time, essentially, like your nervous system is, at least. How do you loosen that? And we'll talk more about this later in this episode. I mean, like, how do we do that with our clients? What has worked for us? Like, eye movement desensitization and reprocessing, EMDR, emotional transformational therapy, ETT, our personal favorite, internal family systems.
Yeah.
And of course, there are tons of other really terrific ways, and no way is better than another. And well, I mean, like maybe, but every person's different.
Everybody has their favorites.
Yes.
And not every mode of therapy works with everybody.
Yeah.
That's why I did a lot of work with Janina Fisher early in my career. And she encouraged me to, she encourages everybody to have at least have 3 models of therapy that you know. I think hers were internal family systems, EMDR, and sensory psychomotor. I don't think I said that right. Sensory motor.
Gotcha. Yeah.
And she's on board and one of the senior trainer for that model. So.
Cool. And the other thing that you said around, I mean, our brain's constantly changing. That's one of the things that gives me hope of, I mean, like things that I'm still processing and overcoming. And how do I like live a holistic, congruent, wholehearted life, you know? And it's, I mean, through the fact that like brains can't, we have like these science behind like how brains like change and can grow. I mean, like, sure, after a certain point, like, I mean, you know more around this of like neurons and what's the trimming that our brain does?
The pruning, the synaptic pruning.
Yes, synaptic pruning and stuff like that. But also, I mean, a lot, or recently, and I think Mark Wynham talks about this in It Didn't Start With You, around how imagination is great for the brain, especially when it comes to healing.
Right. Exactly.
Reintegrating. And I mean, EMDR is a little bit of imaginative at times because it's using like visual memory in your head. So yeah, it's good stuff. And we'll get to
Yeah,
more.
you just, I mean, you just made me think of just talking about the changes in the complexity of our brain. Let me back up even more is our brain has, give or take, 85 billion neurons. It's a lot. 100 trillion synapses and 100 chemical neurotransmitters. And we really only studied about half a dozen of those, maybe 10. I don't know how many, but not very many. You know, so there's a lot going on up there. There's some research that says that any given second, we take in, mostly through our eyes, something like 11 million bits of data. Color and size and texture and light and dark and all that kind of stuff. But we can only focus on about 11 to 50 bits of data. So everything else is going on in the implicit memory, in the subconscious.
Yeah.
Right. So there's a lot going on. Yeah.
Can you define implicit memory?
Typically implicit memory, you think about implicit, there's 2 types, implicit and explicit. Implicit memory is usually considered first the stuff that happens before we were pre-verbal. So somewhere before the age of 3 for sure, but usually 2, somewhere in there. And it can also be described as the stuff that's going on in the background, the things that we're not conscious of, that the other millions of bits of data that are happening at any given moment. Explicit memory is the things that we are aware of, the things that happen to us, usually after the age of 3, where we do have words, we do know what the word sad is and how that feels in our body. What would you add?
Yeah, no, I think that was great and really helpful because implicit and explicit is something that I learned recently within the past like year or so, in the context of the therapeutic clinical realm. But implicit, in short, is the unconscious, and explicit is the conscious. It's the things that we know. And the way that kind of we work, and I think a lot of therapists work, is by helping make the implicit explicit. What are the unconscious things that we're unaware of and making them implicit?
Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
It's why things like a body-centered therapies
Mm-hmm.
work really well with those implicit memories, because you and I both have had clients that came in and they felt something, they were upset, but they had a really hard time describing it.
Yep.
So that's an indication to me that it's implicit memory,
Mm-hmm.
something that happened pre-verbal.
Yeah. Well, thank you for your defense.
Sure.
Um,
Sure. I mean, there are whole books written on this topic that we
yeah.
could, we
Yeah.
covered in 2 minutes.
Yeah. So onward on trauma.
Mhm.
What are the types of trauma out there? And as we kind of get into this, there's conversation around big T and little t trauma. And like, what is that? And like, how do you label different types of trauma? We're not here to really kind of discuss diagnosing, because that is not the orientation that we function out of. Like, I think that you only make a diagnosis if you have to for insurance, and I only make a diagnosis if I have to for an assignment. And part of that is because we have non-pathologizing viewpoints of people, and we can talk more about that later around diagnosis. That it can be incredibly helpful, no doubt, and essential and totally essential at times. But that isn't always the case. But yeah, big T, little t.
Yes. Oh, you're gonna talk? Go ahead.
No, I was just gonna say, like, we had a conversation earlier of nearly taking that out of this list.
Mm-hmm.
And why.
Yeah. Are you asking me?
Yeah. Or just kind of jump in.
Okay. Yeah, we took it out because we don't like that, the comparison.
Mhm.
Because what's little to some person might be big to another. And to sit across a betrayed spouse, because both you and I both do a lot of infidelity work,
Mhm.
or infidelity recovery work, to tell another person that their trauma was, it's little t. Yeah, I don't like that at all. So I don't even use those terms.
Mhm.
But you hear that big T, little t trauma turned or passed around or used.
Yeah.
Maybe that's changing a bit.
Yeah, and because I hear it quite a bit on social media, like big T, little t. For the most part, I feel like I hear it in context of people talking about themselves or
Mm.
types of trauma. And I think this is where I'll add in that we might start talking about specific types of trauma that might be jarring for some folks. We're not going to go into details, but we are going to mention domestic abuse, sexual abuse, complex PTSD, extreme dissociative trauma. So just letting everybody know. Feel into your toes, take a deep breath. It'll be okay. You're all right. We're here with you. Even if you're listening to this recording like weeks or months from now. But yeah, it's like big T, little t trauma is used in the context of self, or like big trauma talking about sexual abuse, domestic violence, big trauma could have happened at one point in time and never again. Or it could have been enduring and throughout an entire period of someone's life. We had the discussion where I think back to some of my own experiences and like with what happened to mom. My mom, your ex-wife, our friend, she was in a really violent carjacking in
2006, November 3rd, 2006.
Yeah, November 3rd, 2006, and was shot and carjacked, survived. She's doing great. Bionic woman.
Mm-hmm. Bulletproof.
Bulletproof. And now, however many years removed, I consider that a little T trauma for myself. Because we did a lot of EMDR as a family around it, like in the right amount of time where it was healthy to start. There are other things that have happened in my life around like relational trauma and like intimate partner violence, betrayal trauma that I consider big T trauma that has affected me in a much bigger way than this other like very traumatic thing that happened to me when I was or happened to my family as a child. But we did a lot of therapy around it. And I think for myself too, I was so little at the time. I was like, what, 8 or 10? A lot of it I don't remember, which is probably a trauma response in some ways. And also I was little. But my brother, who is 4 years older than me, he's 32, he might have an entirely different experience of that. Is there anything that you would like add into that?
No, I mean, yeah, the story we could, but we're not here to talk about the story so much as that the response, you know, it was my response that day when I got the call, and I'm somebody that was EMDR was what I was trained in first before I was trained in anything else. I'm used to sitting with people in trauma, but this is the thing about being a therapist, we still experience all the same things that other people do. So we're a lot of times going through some of the same things.
Yeah.
But I remember I got tunnel vision when I heard the words she'd been carjacked and shot, but she's okay, she's okay, she's okay. And I didn't even know I had a body at that moment in time.
Yeah.
But as I could hear her voice on the other, that the EMTs were talking to her, I started to come back into the here and now. And I think the thing for all of us that day is that we were not alone. She wasn't alone. You and Charlie and I were not alone. I think half the school showed up at the ER when she went into surgery. So unbelievable amount of support. And that was the other thing. And then we all did some EMDR.
Yeah.
All 4 of us did. So I think that's when we talk about aloneness, as we talked about earlier in the episode. So what's coming up for you? This is important.
Yeah. Well, it's that thing that you just said. For those of you that are listening, I'm crying. If you're watching the YouTube, you can see that. It's the moment that you said that we weren't alone. And I thought to the sisterhood that I have of the 5 girlfriends that I have grown up with, that our moms were all pregnant together at the same time. And I have known for 27, 28 years of my life, and their moms who were there for me on that day, and that we weren't alone, and how instrumental that was throughout that whole season. And it just something that I'm like overwhelmed, bursting, melting with gratitude of just like,
Right.
And the acknowledgement that not everyone has that type of support system. And that's a huge reason why I do what I do. And how I recognize that the intimate partner violence, the relational trauma I've experienced, I felt alone. And that's why it was so hard. I wasn't alone, but I perceived that I was. I was also convinced that I was by the partners that I was with. So yeah.
Yeah, that could be a whole nother episode.
Oh yeah. And And the last thing that I'll say on the big T, little t's, and this kind of comparison game is something that Brene Brown says around comparison. And that when we compare, when we say, oh, like they have it worse than I do, like I can't feel bad about this. There are people that have it worse, or I have it worse than somebody else, whatever. We're functioning from a place that makes empathy a scarce resource. When we compare, is we're saying, I don't have enough compassion or empathy for this situation to care about this other person that's going through a lot, and also myself. I should put them first. When both of our experiences and both of our pains and wounds and hurts and traumas are of equal importance. And nobody should ever tell anyone or label anybody else's trauma as big T or little t. And there are the 8 protector parts of me that come online that are like, and if someone does, write in, and I will write them a very strongly worded email to sit down and shut up. But that's a part of me.
Thanks for speaking for that part.
It's a part. I see her. It's cool.
So you hear us talk about parts because we're both IFS therapists. That's our main.
Yeah.
We integrate that with everything else that we do. And we believe that parts live in the mind. And what's the difference between the mind and the brain? They're not the same. That the mind, I keep losing my train of thought.
Well, because you started talking about these parts as an attempt to keep homeostasis. And sometimes the work that they're doing isn't, at a time, it was really helpful.
Well, the parts they're trying to keep some kind of homeostasis, to keep the system, the body, the person safe. And a lot of times what they did the right thing at the right time, but sometimes they get stuck in time and they don't know that either self grew up or self healed or self, is now an adult and not a victim or a little child. And so we think that the parts use our neural networks in the brain really to express themselves, whether they're an exile or a protective part. And either way, the protective parts access these neural networks that haven't been integrated yet. And that's part of what IFS therapy does, that it helps us integrate the neural networks, integrate the experience, the parts of us.
Yeah. And how you're defining this from the internal family systems perspective, I mean, overlays exactly with what I was describing, how trauma works on a neurobiological level. I mean, like, your brain becomes flooded with these stress hormones. Things can't get filed away. So there's this part that still believes the trauma is going on, that doesn't see you have grown up, that doesn't know you are not these scared 6-year-old, 8-year-old, 10-year-old, however anymore. It doesn't know that you are 28, 35, 62. And by creating this kind of internal dialogue, this part starts to see, oh, wait, you've actually lived all of this other life. Maybe I don't need to do what I've been doing for so long anymore. Maybe I don't need to have these, what people might call maladaptive coping skills. At a time, they were adapted. They were super helpful. You had to create them to survive. Now, they're kind of getting in the way of being able to move on, live fully integrated, more cohesive lifestyle, whatever. Yeah. Good shit.
Nice. So let's talk about the types of trauma.
Yeah, take it away.
Okay, so these are 5 broad categories, and not everybody agrees. People, they might name them differently than what I do or what I was taught. Uh, Mostly what I know about trauma, I learned from Frank Anderson, uh, and being a program assistant for him for years and years. So the first category, broad category, what we call is acute stress disorder. And that's where there's an event that usually resolves within a month.
Mhm.
That doesn't make it a little T trauma. It could have been pretty severe, or um, really created a lot of havoc in somebody's life, but it resolved. If you had support, um, if you had resiliency, and that's another topic we can talk about in a
Mhm.
little bit.
Yeah.
Um, but it usually resolves fairly quickly.
Mm-hmm. Because it could be like a one-time event.
Oh, yeah, usually it is. It's a one-time event. I would say a car accident, maybe.
Mm-hmm.
And in my career, I did a lot of EMDR and had a lot of success with people that had even pretty severe car accidents, uh, and they were able to drive again after a couple of sessions of EMDR, sometimes just one.
Mm-hmm.
Um, so talking about that, that's kind of what we would talk about as acute.
Because you could define with what happened to mom.
Mhm,
Like for me, I would maybe consider that as an acute trauma because it happened
mhm,
once. I
mhm,
wasn't there.
mhm,
To my mom, that
mhm,
was a huge event that, like, to
mhm.
this day, I see her, like, there are certain things that she will do or say that she gets really activated and she's able to name it and see it and all of those things. But it's that I don't know if I'm not going to diagnose my mom with PTSD, but it is for her, certainly was not an acute traumatic event.
Yeah, and it may never have developed into PTSD, and that's the one we're going to talk about next,
Mhm.
where the symptoms persist uh, beyond 1 month. Uh, there's lots of intrusive thoughts. There could be um, hypervigilance or avoidance.
Mhm.
Um, and uh, it also, one of the things that can happen if you experience some trauma and then later you experience another, it could be a completely different type of trauma. That first trauma kind of primes the pump for then the second or third or subsequent traumas to then create what we would call maybe PTSD.
Mhm.
And certainly what happened to Amy could have developed into PTSD for her, because one of the hallmarks is either a near death or witnessing
Mhm.
a death. And it's a miracle, you know, that she did not die that day.
Yeah. 2 broken ribs, a punctured lung, grazed her liver, a degree in any other direction, she wouldn't be here today.
Right. Exactly.
Mhm. Um, there's on that topic though of the after experiencing a really traumatic incident that the brain is kind of primed for, I forget the actual verbiage that you used, but um Gabor Maté says that a present trigger can set off emotions that were programmed in the past, and what might seem like a reaction to a present moment is actually reliving a past experience. And that's kind of the definition, one definition that you could define like what being triggered looks like, becoming activated.
Right.
Mhm.
Yeah. Um, so so from there, where we would go if there's more, it's complex PTSD,
Mhm.
uh, ongoing trauma, uh, and or relational trauma. A lot of complex PTSD is relational. That's what mostly comes in our office. Not always, but that's a big part of this.
Mhm.
Repeated interpersonal violations.
Mhm.
Yes.
And yeah, and I would think to add a caveat or clarification on what you're saying is like it's the relational trauma. There's like a Venn diagram of relational trauma and complex PTSD. Like we're not saying that everyone that walks into our office has complex PTSD, but most of what we do see is that relational trauma, which is often on enduring, is the other way that I've heard like complex PTSD described as that is enduring. Like you are enduring something over and over and over again. It wasn't a one-time incident like an acute trauma. It's ongoing.
Which leads to some of the symptoms of that can be very difficult to regulate your emotions.
Mm-hmm.
That's a big one, which leads to difficulties in relationships.
Mm-hmm.
People talk about that when they come into my office that they don't know themselves. They have a hard time thinking. They don't. There's been changes in the way that they pay attention or the way that they go through their day. They talk about, I don't even know who I am anymore.
Mm-hmm.
So those are just broad categories of complex PTSD and or relational trauma.
Mm-hmm.
The next one is developmental trauma. And this is just relational trauma, but it happened in childhood. I would say anywhere from 0 to 18 years of age.
Mm-hmm.
We know that the brain isn't fully developed until 25, but usually it's somewhere in that childhood, adolescence period. It will matter at that point. We talked about this before, you and I have, where the same traumas could have happened to a 6-year-old, and it's not going to have the same effect typically if the same thing happened to an 18-year-old, like you were just describing. Actually, I think you were 10 or 11. If it was 2006, that would have made you 11,
Right.
right? Well, 10, just before your 11th
Yeah, it was
birthday.
just before my 11th birthday. Yeah.
Yeah, so you were 10 years old.
What a
Charlie
shitty
was 14
birthday.
years old.
Yeah. What a shitty birthday present.
Yeah, right.
What the hell?
Well, yeah. Uh, I don't even remember your birthday that year.
Neither do I.
Yeah, wonder why.
Yeah.
Yeah, but I think about even that day. Amy was at the hospital. She was in ICU. I wasn't going to be able to stay with her the night, and I had you and him, and he wanted to go home with his best friend at the time, and you wanted to come straight home with me, which was what he needed. And I fully supported what he needed in that moment. He knew that Amy was going to be okay. We all did at that point, but he wanted the support of his best friend. He probably to not think about it, and we could talk to him about if he remembers what that was like for him. Just my point is the same thing can happen in childhood, and because of the age, lots of other factors too, people are going to respond differently to a developmental trauma.
And this discussion, I mean, I said a second ago, I'm in like, with what happened to mom, I might call that an acute trauma. You could also maybe call it a developmental trauma based on when it happened.
Well, yeah, to you and Charlie.
Yeah, to Charlie and I. And this conversation isn't we're not telling anybody how to categorize their trauma. We're giving context around how you could. It's do with what you will with this information. And so we're not here to say, if you had this at this time, at this ages, and this is what it was, this is probably what you have now. That's not the purpose of this conversation. It's had to have a conversation and to think about some of these things.
Yeah, to give it context.
Yeah, to give it context.
Yeah. And then last is extreme or dissociative trauma. And this is how I got to know Janina Fisher. Is I got my first DID client, dissociative identity client, or what we used to call multiple personality disorder. And I didn't know how to work with that person. So what you have to do is refer or get a lot of supervision as you learn how to do this. And so that's when I did 4 years of Janina Fisher's neurobiology of trauma. I think she calls it something different now. And I did a lot of individual supervision with her over my first DID case. So you may, with this extreme form of trauma, it's extreme abuse, extreme. And I don't want to get sensational about it. And sometimes, like with this first case that I have, I don't know that I fully know what the actual trauma was, and I don't need to know. I don't want her to go relive it, but this is where IFS is really helpful with these extreme, really parts, in the DID world or the dissociative world, we would call them alters, but they're already there. So, and they're using these neural networks to express themselves, to keep the system safe, that kind of thing. So this is where IFS works beautifully with these people that have experienced extreme life threats, usually when they're very, very, very young. What are you gonna say?
And well, there are two things. Because one, did I hear you say at one point that one of your DID clients wouldn't necessarily categorize for that anymore?
Right.
Which is really cool and a testament to what we discussed at the beginning, of that the brain is capable of healing and change. But I don't know a better example to create healing, integration, processing, to go from a dissociative identity diagnosis to not categorizing that as anymore. And what also a fucking awesome therapist you are. Take the compliment.
Thanks.
And the other thing that you said that I started snapping internally was you're like, I don't need to know the story. I don't need to know the history to be able to provide support and care.
Right.
And that is the definition of trauma-informed care. I'm breaking out in hives again because I'm excited about it, and I feel really passionate about this, because how often I hear people's experiences that are trying to process or heal from trauma, and they're forced to go back in time to relive it without the support of something like ETT, EMDR, IFS. To just go back and rehash the story and to talk about it isn't helpful. It can be really, like, truly more harmful. And there's certainly some criticisms around EMDR, and I agree there's some people that it doesn't work for, because it can feel like you're going back in time and rehashing it too much. And I completely understand that. And this is
in there.
Say that again.
Can I add something?
Yeah.
Well, with EMDR or IFS or anything, I think about it this way. Sometimes there are parts that need to tell the story.
Absolutely, yeah.
And if it's coming from that place, then I can sit and I can listen with compassion and empathy, understanding, love, support, whatever, so that they have a different experience in that moment. But that's only if there's parts and all parts agree that the story needs to be told.
Mm-hmm.
And sometimes the story comes out in bits and pieces,
Mm-hmm.
and sometimes they need to tell it over and over again. But that's where, even as they tell the story, again, I learned this from Janina Fisher, is to be able to have the vibrating paddles that people can hold, and have them hold those things as they tell the story.
Mm-hmm.
It can ground them, or any kind of bilateral stimulation,
Mm-hmm.
as the parts tell the story. And that's where this, being a synthesizer, if you will, of different models and what works for this person may not work for the next person. And it
Right.
takes a lot of attunement on the therapist's part,
Mm-hmm.
to try something.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
Trust your gut. And if it doesn't work, okay, that doesn't work. Let's try this.
Yeah. And for the client, that, and this is what I tell friends and my own clients, I'm like, if this isn't working for you, this is your time, and you tell me. Especially when it comes around just like discussing trauma, is the amount of times that I have heard both friends and clients talk about experiences where they've been to a therapist that had the client talk about the trauma and in more detail than what they were comfortable in, it being a really traumatic experience. And that's not to blame the therapist. I'm not going to do that because I don't know what their objectives were or anything like that. But the protective parts of me come online and really want to voice the importance of being able to have the space to say, this isn't working for me. I need to try something different. And it's the therapist's job to adjust there, or get really curious with the client of, okay, what's not working? Help me understand. Thank you for everyone for listening with us, and having this conversation with us around different types of trauma. I know that there is so much information here, and we've just like barely touched the surface. And as we discussed too, that like we're really wanting just to provide context and information, and what we've learned, what we're passionate about, what we've seen to work, and all of those things.
Yeah, I just want to add, just on the piggyback on what you just said, that there are dozens and dozens and dozens of books,
Mm-hmm.
Documentaries on trauma in general.
Mm-hmm.
And I want to encourage anybody that's listening, that listening to a podcast or Instagram or TikTok, even reading a really good book, is no substitute for getting therapy from a good therapist that knows, that at least has one model of trauma therapy under their belt.
Mm-hmm.
So yeah, I just felt compelled to say,
Mm-hmm.
we barely scratched the surface, like you said,
Yeah.
on covering this topic, and we'll come back to it probably many times, because this is what we do. But we don't want to overwhelm people with information.
Yeah.
We just want to
Start.
introduce it. Yeah, start a conversation, introduce a topic.
Mm-hmm.
And like you said earlier too, we will have in the show notes resources that we've referred to, that books that are palatable for people, that don't get all bogged down in research.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
So
Yeah, for sure. Yeah, the show notes will have the list of sources of the things that we've mentioned, and probably some other helpful information as well. Wherever you're listening to us, please subscribe, like, rate, only if it's a 5-star review. Okay, maybe not. Share your honest opinion, because we want it. Although there are parts of me that don't.
all parts are welcome.
And all parts are welcome. That's right. And thanks for joining us in this conversation today. We will pick up in the next episode of more around what are the symptoms of trauma, how does it show up? And then getting to the good stuff that is the hope of resilience, overcoming trauma, and all of those good things. Do you have any other last things you want to add, Dad?
No, just thanks for joining us.
Yeah.
I really appreciate your time together, our time together.
Yeah, me too. Great. Well, I love you. I'll talk to you later.
I love you too. Talk to you later.
Bye.
Bye.
Thank you for listening to this episode of Bridging Generations, Exploring Mental Health Together. This podcast is not a substitute for therapy. If you or someone you love is struggling, click the link in our podcast notes for a list of resources and to find mental health services in your area. Subscribe now and embark on this journey with us. Together, we can challenge barriers and build bridges to better mental health. And as always, lead with curiosity. We'll see you next time.